Hi, James. How are you? Welcome to the podcast.
I'm good. Nice to see you.
I thought we'd start really if you could give us an introduction about yourself, I suppose, who you are, where you work, and the sort of context you work in.
Yeah, so, well, it's probably on the bottom of the screen right now for people watching, but my name's James Waller. In my day job, I am the head teacher of Sunningdale School, which is a specialist provision for children with severe, profound multiple learning difficulties as well as autism. We run a large outreach organization known as the Sen Hub out of the school as well. It's a multi-site school, but I also wear a number of other hats. So I am the chairperson of Equals, a large non-for-profit organization that works with schools and families of children with severe and profound learning difficulties, again, as well as autism. I'm also engaged with the DFE's early years expert advisory group on SEND and Special Education Consortium, which is part of the Council for Disabled Children, the National SEND Forum, and the Federation of Leaders of Special Education.
So you're busy enough.
Yeah, absolutely. Like too busy, if anything. But yeah, and I'm sure I've forgotten some stuff in there as well. So but it's probably worse than I've even described my.
So do you want to tell us a bit more about Sunningdale then, and sort of how long you've worked there, and
Yeah, so Sunningdale based in Sunderland in Tyne Wear, so almost as kind of we're nearly in Scotland, pretty much, right up in the northeast of England. Yeah, it's a school for children with, like I say, severe, profound multiple learning difficulties. We have a significant proportion of children that have autism, and what, at least in some academic circles, is starting to be described as children with complex learning difficulties. So children that have really like the level of cognition or executive functioning that would usually be associated with severe learning difficulties, but often with a range of other facets of the presentation of their learning difficulties. So they will be children that tend to communicate behaviorally, non-verbally and behaviorally, lots of proto-imperative communication, like I want this, I don't want that, but usually communicated, as I say, through behavior, very fleeting in their engagement. So a profile of a child that's very complex to engage in learning, and that's probably becoming the largest cohort of children that we have attend the school. The school has 160 children. It also has a satellite early years provision, which is a specialist early years provision just for the most complex children in the city of Sunderland, and the local authority supports the local authority. And as I was describing before, it has quite a large outreach arm. So the school's relatively well known because of our association with a lot of organizations, really, and some of the work we've done with those most complex children. But as a result of that, we do offer a lot of outreach. We get visited by a lot of schools. We've had schools visitors from right across the country and other countries and departments of education from Chile, New Zealand, Singapore, the Cayman Islands, which is interesting, that has its own department for education. I'm desperately trying to get a reciprocal visit over Cayman Islands. So yeah, like it's a school with it's a very multifaceted school, massively involved in supporting mainstream schools that surround us as well as some national work on that in that area as well.
I mean, you're talking about your school and my school. I was a leader in Cherry Garden in London, has a lot of similarities in terms of cohort, but also I know that we've both been on similar journeys as leaders, I think, in terms of the type of provision we want to see in our schools. Probably about 10, 15 years ago at Cherry Garden School, we started on a journey to make the whole school play-based from 2 to 11, which I know is sort of the same sort of age range as at Sunningdale. And we thought loads about assessment as well around that time and how we could make that more child-centered. And I suppose I'd quite like that to be the focus of the conversation today, really, those two elements, really, sort of provision and pedagogy, and then sort of how we can make our assessment as child-centered as possible. And I think this is a really important year in the world of SEND. There's loads of stuff going on, loads of reforms going on, a lot of which you are sort of involved in. And sort of on a really basic level, it sounds like there's going to be there's going to be a lot more resource bases, ARPs, or whatever we call them, in specialist spaces in our mainstream primary schools. There's going to be a bit of a pause by the sounds of it on sort of building new specialist specific schools. And so there's an opportunity really to establish new spaces in primary schools. But obviously with that, quality is going to be really important. So I think it's going to be great today to listen to some of your thoughts on what sort of progressive education looks like for children with sort of complex support needs, and how we can make the whole process as child-centered as possible. I wonder if you had a touch just on that sort of pedagogy really around what daily life might look like at Sunningdale for your children.
Yeah, I think you've touched on a few points there that I think are especially important to I suppose, focus on or draw attention to, in that a big thing for us here at Sunningdale is, and I'm sure we'll get into this at some point, but is the individualization, the personalization of everything we do. But that personalization is really driven through a lens of functionality. So it's about what is the purpose of this? Like, why do we do what we do? And really looking at how do we equip the children that we have who, as we're seeing a complexity shift in SEND, are increasingly becoming complex for us in our provision. How do we get to functional, impactful, meaningful outcomes for that group of learners, and what does that need to look like? And for us as a school, for probably at least the last decade, but probably longer, there's been a very heavy focus on, what do meaningful outcomes look like in terms of preparation for life and preparation for adulthood for the cohorts and the individual children that attend the school. And if we have an idea of what that looks like and where we're going, then how do we get children there? And you touch on play-based learning, for example. So something that's massively overlooked is the use of play-based learning in developing functionality, and functional application of the learning and the understanding that the children and young people that attend our settings have. Because we acknowledge as a sector, I find play fascinating, because what we acknowledge as a sector is that play is one of the most vital developmental stages that any child will go through. That's, it's heavily researched. There is research on play that doesn't even cite its importance. It will say things in the research like play is so heavily researched that at this point its impact is kind of non-debatable. And there'll be sentences to that effect in documents around play-based learning. That's how accepted the impact of that stage of development is. But as an education system, we have this, it's really strange that in our education system, you usually have to complete the previous stage before you can move to the next stage. So this is how all of our kind of accreditation and qualifications are set up, for example. So just keeping this really black and white and dead simple, you have to have done GCSEs to then do A-levels. You need A-levels usually or an equivalent to access university and so on. So we have a kind of stage system of education where you must kind of complete, in some sense, the previous stage before you move to the next one. What's fascinating to me is that we acknowledge this importance of play, but at no point do we have in place a system where you must have completed, in inverted commas, your ability to play before you move into what we think of as kind of standardized teaching and learning. And what's fascinating about that is when you start to get into play and you break down play into its social stages. So if we think about solitary players moving into being onlookers and then moving into parallel play and moving through parallel play and associative and more collaborative types of play. And the same with cognitive types of play. If you think about going from very early physical play and object play into far more sophisticated types of play, like role play, for example, like these are really important stages of development that it's really important young people develop and go through in order to lay the foundation for all their future learning. So a lot of our functional application of our later learning, so all of our subject-specific learning, things like numeracy and literacy, our ability to cross-contextualize that and apply that to the real world comes from a lot of these very early skills that we develop through play. And things like, if we start to talk about some of our most complex young people in education, particularly youngsters with autism, say, it's things like role play are where we develop our empathetic abilities to put ourselves in other people's shoes. We put ourselves into another role and we act and imagine and think like that other person or people in that role. You know, when we're playing being the teacher, we are trying to think how we think the teacher thinks. When we're trying to role play being the doctor, we're trying to think how the doctor thinks. And that it's a really important skill that we then rely on much later in life. But what's fascinating is most schools are set up to kind of, you get to reception, you get to year one. You know, if you're really progressive school, you probably will still be doing play, and maybe year one, there'll be aspects of a play-based curriculum still. But it's really rare that you get beyond, say, year one and you encounter a school that still has any aspects of play-based curriculum outside of PE. So but it's the only stage of our kind of development where we will move someone on before they have developed all the skills you would expect them to have developed. And then we get to 16, 17, 18, 19 years old and wonder why we have children, particularly children with learning difficulties and disabilities, that aren't able to apply the functional skills that they do have around things like literacy and numeracy to real world situations. But that's a very complex thing to do. And we potentially were set up in a way that we were potentially going to skip the consolidation of those skills very early in somebody's education. Apart from that, I mean, I'm a massive advocate of play-based learning because it's motivating. You can set up play-based learning opportunities to be really motivating and engaging to children. And if you ever visited my own setting, so if you came to Sunningdale, you'd see we have systems and processes built around how you engage children in their learning so that, again, it's self-initiated, self-motivated, it's intrinsically motivated rather than extrinsically motivated. And children want to learn, they want to engage with their learning. And it's a really powerful tool for that, even if you're going to ignore all the developmental importance of developing those, you know, social and cognitive stages and types of play.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've touched on, for me, the most important word in any stage of education is engagement. And that, for me, was a huge driving force for implementing that sort of those play-based strategies. I think there's a couple of interesting things to pull from what you were saying and to sort of maybe question, I suppose. And so you talk about the levels of play. I think there's definitely been more of a quite progressive movements around sort of play patterns for autistic children in the last few years, and that sort of celebrating all types of play. So as much as it's really important for us to understand how play typically develops, also have the capability to celebrate play that doesn't necessarily fit into those that linear development, but also the sort of notion of how play is important in neurotypical teenagers and adults and outside of education. Sort of this is generally how we learn new skills, whether we're playing on an instrument or being creative in art or in sport, like you sort of mentioned with PE. And that it's still a really important way to learn by doing something, practically engaging with it and tweaking and adjusting how we actually doing something. It's such a powerful thing. And I think, it's such a shame that there is this sort of, I know in your school you use language like pre-formal and semi-formal and formal learning, and it gets so formal so soon in our country. You go into year one, and I've got two children who are in primary school, and both of them, it was so depressing picking them up from school that first few weeks in year one. They were really like, they got used to it and they enjoy school, but it was so, especially as someone who's worked in early years and in education, it was just depressing just listening to them. So we don't get to choose. I didn't do any drawing today. I didn't do any colouring today, and that was my little girl's favourite thing in the world, doing her art. And it was really soul destroying, to be honest. This just happens, and it's amazing in specialist education that we have more license, I suppose, to embrace it.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting because it's around meaningful, like what you're touching on is you're touching on several things, but I think that when we talk about the more license of special schools, it's around it does exist and it doesn't exist, because what is expected of a specialist provision is not really that different to a mainstream provision, is that in that you're looking for impact. You're looking for meaningful impact. Now, if I want to be a doctor, that that requires, that meaningful kind of approach, and what I'm going to need from my education is going to be different. I'm going to need, I'm going to have to study sciences, and I'm going to have to go through that route and those qualifications. So it's not actually a different type of thinking. It's just thinking about, actually, for somebody who has more complex needs. And I know, like, there's no definition of complex. There is this kind of academic definition of complex learning difficulties that's not widely accepted, and it means different things to different people. But when we talk about more complexity of needs, so moving into moderate and severe learning difficulties, it's thinking about, it's just to focus on, well, what is meaningful? What are we kind of aiming at for this young person? And how are we going to develop their ability to be a part of the community? How are we going to, develop their understanding of positive mental health and physical health? And how are we going to develop their independence? And employment. What does future employment and life and living and housing and everything look like for this young person? How are we going to set them up for that? And I think what special schools have had license, I suppose, to do is reflect on that and really focus on what that means, and work towards that in a very meaningful way. Because there's another aspect to specialist provision that makes this kind of more complicated in a way, in that another thing we're quite accepting of in the specialist sector is that some of the skills we're going to try and develop may take a very, very long time to learn for the children and young people that we have, because of the needs that we're presented with in the cohorts we teach. So, for example, like, people will persevere with trying to teach number development. So something as simple as counting, or kind of subtraction and addition at a very quite simple level sometimes. They'll persevere with that, like, for 10 years, 15 years. And schools will try and find all kinds of different ways to develop that skill, because they know for somebody to try and manage, budget or time or anything like that, they're going to need some level of that kind of basic numeracy. And they'll do the same with literacy. Like, again, we know for somebody to be a fluent reader, they're going to have to be able to blend and segment. Now, however you manage to get them there, you're going to have, like, if you want them to be fluent, you're going to have to try and get them there. If you need them at least to have functional literacy, you're going to have to start using strategies that are going to develop that as well, or instead of. And we accept this in the specialist sector, that we might work on very similar, barely moving or possibly laterally moving developmental skills, and very early subject specific skills for a really, really long time. And we're very accepting of that. And so we take this approach to our teaching, that we do a lot of over teaching and trying to maintain skills and increase the fluency of the skill, and, how cross-contextualized it can be, and all of those things, how spontaneously used it can be. And we do that. It's not really a different type of thinking. We're aiming at an ambitious outcome for that youngster. And I think that's where then your play comes in, is because when we start to talk about functionality, if we're also going to accept that it might take 10 or 15 years for somebody to be able to kind of count up to and then add and subtract numbers to like 50, and it might take us 15 years to do that, we have to then also, the same line of thinking has to come online in parallel, is that it's got to be that, well, something as complex as applying that to a dynamic situation like the real world, so the person actually has independence and agency and can functionally use whatever level of, say, if we stick with numeracy, whatever level of numeracy they're going to get to, so they can functionally use that. We're going to have to start teaching that very, very early as well, and start persevering with that. And it's that kind of thinking that then leads, I think, schools that are truly thinking about impact and reflecting on the cohorts of learners they've got into strategies like play-based learning, because they realize, like, I need a strategy, a pedagogical strategy here that is going to teach a child to have these skills and will engage them in their learning, which was the other point you kind of made, was about the engaging nature of play-based learning and those approaches. But also it's a strategy that's going to develop cross-contextualization, what in the engagement model would be referred to as more advanced realization. like the application of those skills across contexts and in different ways. And that has to start very early. I think we still have schools, absolutely, that get the idea of we're going to teach numeracy and literacy for like 10 years just to get to a very basic level. And then at 16 years old, suddenly have in inverted commas, life skills curriculum and try and suddenly teach something as complicated as reading a bus timetable and getting on a bus and going to a supermarket and navigating a supermarket and then, getting around a shopping center and all of that kind of stuff. But like with somebody who took 12 years to learn to count to 15, and it's like, well, if it took them 12 years to learn to count to 15, they're not going to learn something as complex as all of that other functional real world stuff in like 4 years. That needs to start early as well. And I think, but what I would suggest is it's not a different thought process to a mainstream school, because mainstream school is setting somebody up for life beyond school. There's a debate. I mean, that could be a whole chat in and of itself, couldn't it, as to whether they really do that. But theoretically, they are setting somebody up with the tools they need to move to the next stage of their life in the career or whatever they're aiming at. I think specialist settings are just doing the exact same type of thinking. It's just our cohort of learners is generally so different in their presentation that has to look really different. So it should, if you're doing this well, lead you to different approaches and different types of pedagogies, I think.
Something I know you talk about is like learner characteristics for your individual children. I thought if you could just touch on that briefly before maybe we explore the assessment side of things.
Yeah, definitely. So I think what we found fascinating at our own school, so this goes right back to our school's vision. So our school's vision, if we summarize it in a word, we talk about a child being more. And you can see probably behind me, like I've got a graffitied kind of be more framed poster there. And that is our simplification of the school's vision, is that we want every child to be more, but be more in whatever way is important to them. Because you can finish that kind of sentence however you like. So they can be more active, be more communicative, be more, resilient, whatever it is that they need to develop. And that's also, that can be dynamic. So that can change as the child is growing and developing. It can change week on week, term on term, year on year. And what we kind of try to acknowledge through the school's vision is that if every child's kind of potential and ambitions are going to be unique to them, then the approaches that you're going to have to take with the child are going to need to be kind of unique and dynamic as well. So you've got to have systems set up that are going to be appropriate for that, that level of flexibility and that dynamism. But in order to do that, what you've got to also do is understand the cohorts of children that you actually have. So when we very first kind of moved to this, we've always had a personalized approach to the school for at least I've been here since 2012, 2013. So quite significant period of time. And we've always had a level of personalization in what we do. But when we kind of moved into this fully, we spoke to all the parents about what they wanted for their children. So this is a very stakeholder-driven approach. We met with all of our parents, we met with our governors, all of our staff. We also did a lot of work with pupils around just gathering, by the time a child leaves Sunningdale School, what skills, attributes, knowledge, characteristics, whatever, do they want the child to have? What do they want them to be able to do? What do they want that presentation to be? And that's where we kind of started to land on this idea of not only do our families and our pupils and our young people that attend the school want to have functional skills, they want agency, they want independence, they want to be able to communicate freely in an appropriate way for them. But we realized that it was really individual to various families and various children. And that's, like I say, that's where we kind of got to this vision of acknowledging that they're all individuals, all their potentials different, all their aspirations different. And we summarize it as this be more. But for any of that to work, you have to understand where the child's starting from and how to meet that need. So what we generally had done as a school was think of our children like lots of schools do, using the kinds of categories, for lack of a better way of describing it, that you get in the school census data. So, SLD, PMLD, sensory impairment, ASD or autism. And we would think about the children like that, and we'd have approaches. But what we realized was, sort of 10, 12 years ago, maybe not that long when we got into this fully, and this changes year on year, but was actually, if we're going to acknowledge them as individuals, that information is really irrelevant to us. And what's much more important is how they actually present day in, day out. So we look at their characteristics as learners and how they present in terms of a range of facets. So, for example, when we're thinking about our curriculum pathways, so the school has curriculum pathways you touched on earlier, like a lot of schools do. We have called them pre-formal, semi-formal, informal and formal, and those kinds of titles that get used all over the place, really because of the influence of equals in particular. But and we don't actually use those labels anymore at Sunningdale. We've more recently moved away from them. But the way that we define those pathways and the approaches that are going to happen in those pathways is we look at these characteristics and we'll look at what does the child's communication look like? So how does their communication present and how developed is their communication? We'll look at their ability to engage. So what does their engagement look like in terms of exploration and persistence? And this is regardless, this isn't the statutory model of engagement. This is regardless of the child's developmental level. What does their persistence look like? What does their exploration look like, particularly for functionality? How sophisticated is their realization in terms of our understanding of it in the engagement model? Then what we'll also do is start to look at their emotional development. What does that look like? How does that present? How well do they regulate? Their social development, same kind of idea. How do they present socially? What's their understanding socially? All of these, we start to break down all of these facets, and eventually we get to the conventional assessment type information. So in terms of assessments, where are they on an assessment framework developmentally? Where are they kind of landing? That'll be the final piece of that information. And year on year, these characteristics kind of grow out. So this becomes more granular as and gets a bit more sophisticated year on year, and the characteristics we use. But then we have a really thorough understanding of the holistic kind of presentation of the child, but at a very individualized level. And that's how we then decide, actually, we're going to develop a pathway that it'll have a generalized kind of approach that will start to meet this group of characteristics. This other pathway will have a generalized approach that starts to meet this group of characteristics. And then what we have as a school is a system, classroom-based system that's based around two pieces of paper, basically. We use engagement motivators, which I'll explain, and personalized learning plans that then individualize what's happening in every classroom and even at the level of every single child. So it becomes really individualized. But in terms of us understanding the groups of characteristics and the groups of presentation that we have, I suppose cohorts of presentation that we have, we break it down into these granular levels. And then we match our approaches to that. I think what we had done historically was we had approaches we thought would work for children with learning difficulties. We had put them in place. We'd done loads of training on them. We'd embedded them and blah, blah, blah. And then we would go about the process of like, oh, that child fits there, that child fits there, that child fits there, which, obviously the more appropriate approach is to treat it as if you're kind of starting from scratch and like, let's see what we've got and then let's match approaches to that. So that's what we now do as a school every single year. And I just think that's vital in understanding, if we're going to talk about assessment, we're going to talk about impact. How do you know if that's effective or relevant if you don't know what the actual presentation of the learners you've got is in the first place? So I think that's vital.
I think it's on a really basic level. I think this is so important. It's just getting to know your children as best as you possibly can. And obviously coming from that, you've got this structured way of establishing that and ensuring that people are thinking about the right elements of that. But again, it can be transferred it should be transferred to any stage of education, any type of educational setting, right? I think right through sort of further and higher education, people who are working in these places need to know that the students and the children that they're teaching really well and understand the style of learning that they require and always be thinking back to that engagement type focus of sort of, are they going to be interested in what we're providing here? Is this going to be something that's going to motivate them to learn? But it's really great that is the true focus. And I think sometimes we don't necessarily understand how long it takes to really get to know our children well and how much focus we need to sort of put on that, especially in that first term or that first year that they're with us. Um, if we just if we shift on then to sort of the notion of child-centered assessment, and this is something that I talk about a lot. I suppose maybe if you could sort of briefly tell us what you feel that phrase means and how relevant it is to your work at Sunningdale.
Yeah, I mean, it's massively important. And probably from what I've already said, it's that like our attempt is to have a huge focus on kind of dynamic and agile ways of looking at our learners and making sure we have meaningful outcomes for those children that are unique to them where necessary, they need to be unique. I think it's our assessment works in, I mean, it's probably easiest to describe the way our assessment works at the school in the context of how we set up our classrooms. So we have an approach to setting up our classrooms and our pedagogy that's heavily based in engagement, which we've talked about already, but we specifically use a breakdown of a set of every single child's engagement motivators in order to design our classroom provision. So this came about, we were one of the schools that piloted the engagement model as part of the Rochford Review. So we'd already worked a little bit with Professor Barry Carpenter's model of engagement and aspects of engagement. But we weren't a fan of the scale necessarily, and there were bits of it we were borrowing for our practice. And then we became a school that was piloting the work of the Rochford Review and later some of the design aspects of that. But what we found fascinating is when you use that statutory model, whatever version you use, and this would be about 2015, 16, we kind of came across this or started to kind of develop this, was as you look at somebody's exploration and their persistence, and, you know, particularly things like persistence and exploration as those areas, you collect evidence of that. So you're using, you know, a tool, whatever tool, there are multiple tools available, but I appreciate we're obviously on the Tapestry podcast here. So, you know, there are whatever tool you're using to gather that information about, well, how sophisticated is somebody's exploration? You know, how long are they persisting? You know, how developed is that becoming? You start to realize that the observations and the kinds of evidence that you're collecting, you will notice patterns. So we started to realize it's always those resources. It's always those activities. It's always that room. It's always, and we start to break this down as a school. So what we developed was a system of like collecting information about the types of resources, the types of activities, the types of physical environments, the types of times of day and events, and that aspect of observations, but also then support, interaction, and people. And we start to map out for every single child, well, what's coming up all the time in their best present when they're really, really engaged? What is it? Which resources, which activities, which rooms, all of that. And we did that for a while, and we started to build this picture of what their motivators were. What are their most motivating set of circumstances? Because what we were thinking at that point was, if we can take that resource through that activity in that room and interact with them in this way, then we've got the best possible chance of engaging even our most complex children with the most fleeting engagement in whatever learning we're going to attempt. What we've done over time, or what we did quite quickly actually but we've done over time and got really embedded in the last decade or more, is taking that to quite a granular level. So in terms of if we stick with resources, because it's the probably most straightforward area, when we initially encounter this with a child and start to gather this information, we'll start to realize, oh, it's that resource, and that resource. He really likes those three resources, or she really likes those three resources. But what that's useful, like if it's somebody who's very difficult to engage and we know these three resources, we can kind of work with that. But what's far more useful is if we understand what connects those resources in terms of like a sensory aspect or a schematic, you know, something schematic that's connecting them, or if it could be cognitive as well. Because if we understand that, what we can do is start to present the child or young person with new and novel experiences, can draw them into other types of learning, knowing they're likely to engage with them because we understand what it is about resources they like to engage with. And then we just apply that thinking to all those other domains. So in terms of activities, which obviously become a bit more complex than just resources, what is it about the activities? Why does the child engage with those kinds of activities? Same with rooms is really fascinating, because inevitably the rooms that children are most motivated by are not rooms they can access in the school building all day, every day. So you get into, well, why is it these three rooms? Like, what is it about the rooms? And sometimes that can be quite surprising. So it might be that the room has very little stimulation in it. So it's a very bare room, and it's like quite low lighting, something like that. It can be the exact opposite as well, though. It might be that the rooms are always very busy with lots of light, lots of flash, and like, the types of things that theory would generally suggest shouldn't really be engaging and shouldn't support persistence and those kinds of things. Actually, sometimes it is that, because children and people are individuals. So you can kind of analyze that, and the supports and types of interaction are really fascinating, because you get a lot of our most complex children where people say, oh, it's always like Phil. They'll do anything for Phil. Like they'll engage with Phil and and it's like, but why? What does Phil do? Like, how is he interacting with the child? And what we found really fascinating is some of the things you take for granted aren't always true. So often we'll get our children with wheelchairs, and perceived wisdom would be, you're going to speak to somebody in a wheelchair, you drop to their eye line, you make sure you're in front of them, you engage with them that way, and that's how you'd communicate with somebody in a wheelchair. Some of our children's preferred communication strategies in terms of interaction are actually that you stay stood up above them, that can be in front of them. For some of our children, it's to the side of them. And it's because we kind of imagine that it's because that's their whole world, is people they're in their wheelchair and they do engage with the world with most people stood above them. So that's become their preferred type of communication. But when you analyze that, it's really interesting that some of our children will engage better in ways that would probably be considered like not good practice if you didn't understand that that's actually how the child prefers to interact with people. So what we do is we take that set of information and we set up every room in the school, every single classroom in the school is built around this set of information for the 6 to 9 children in that room. So what we know we have in those rooms are activity set up and an approach in a room and an environment and people who are going to interact with them in a way that we are most likely to secure their engagement in whatever they're about to do. So that's how the school is set up. But that's then when our the approach to their actual discrete development in terms of skills and knowledge and things, and I suppose starts to touch on assessment, comes in. Because what we then do is look developmentally where the children are in terms of their cognition and their executive functioning, their communication and interaction, their social and emotional development, their physical and sensory development. And we start to scaffold or think about where are the next developmental steps for them in each of those areas? Where do they need to go in their curriculum, or if it's kind of curriculum based and knowledge based, or where do they need to go in terms of skills, if it's a skill based thing? And what we do is we take the information around how to engage them, so all that motivator information, we use that as the basis for the environment, but we think about the types of activities and things that we're going to do with the child in the context of where they are developmentally and how we will use that activity to move their learning on. And what we do is we set up the rooms. There's a kind of double layer of the rooms. So there's this engagement aspect to it, but then all of those activities are tweaked within the context of where do I need the pupils in this room to be going next? How am I going to scaffold their learning with these activities? How am I going to use them to drive their development forward? What we see as a school because of that, now it's hard for us because we've done this for a very long time, but when we very first, I suppose when we first went fully into this, which would be around the time of the pandemic, when we really went kind of full on, we're diving in the deep end and we're abandoning everything else, which, all of our other approaches. And we still had a data set from a few years before that we were able to use for comparison. Our pupils make significantly more progress. We have a more complex cohort that make faster progress than historically our pupils did. And that wouldn't be a surprise because we know we're likely to engage them in their learning. And the setup of that room has a massive impact on where we place demands on children as well. We know that if, at the point when you're being put under demand, you have a stress response. You know, lots of us, like myself included, don't always have the biggest window of tolerance to that stress response and being put under massive demand. So what sometimes happens for us is we'll go, you know, we will waste that kind of window of opportunity where we're eating through somebody's tolerance of demand, just getting them to the learning in the first place. So by the time they hit the learning, you know, their brain's flooded with adrenaline and cortisol, and we're starting to see, you know, language, receptive language and expressive language levels drop, and their ability to retain information drop. And then they obviously naturally make slower progress at those activities. If that's not required and you're going to place the demand on them, they've already engaged with the activity, it makes sense that they make faster progress. So we have that, and that is then tied into this idea of how we move the learning forward. So it's the way we look at outcomes and learning intentions for children, or some people would describe targets for children, is really individualized based on where they are, not just how they're going to engage, but actually where they are developmentally across those areas as well.
There's so much to unpack there, James. What you talked about there. I think some things that I'd sort of picking up on that. For me, that process that you're describing, some people think of assessment as just this sort of summative thing, and I know sort of formative assessment is a thing as well. But for me, especially working in early years environments or in specialist environments, it's the sort of in the moment assessment of how well a child is engaging and partaking and enjoying and feeling safe and feeling comfortable, and those assessments that you're making in the moment. And obviously you've come up with this brilliant sort of structured way of establishing what is just right for those children, which is brilliant, and that is so child-centered. But it's that ongoing assessment of how well is this actually going? Is this child want to be with me? What is it about the way that I'm interacting with them that is making this a positive experience or whatever? So I think that's, so great to hear. I think sort of just when you were talking about that sort of individual motivations and stuff, and I think sometimes we can fall into the trap of, you were talking about resources and what is it about that resource that's making this child interesting. I sometimes come back to examples of children who I presume that they just love Thomas the Tank Engine because they're always carrying this train around, and so everything will be Thomas the Tank Engine themed around the space for this child. But actually that's not it. It's the push and the pull. It's not Thomas. I mean, it might be, and in some circumstances it is. It's the bright, colourful face and the colours, but a lot of the time for this child, it's the push and the pull. So let's go with the verb. You know, what are they actually doing with this train that they will not let go of? What do they love about it? And that might be our route into expanding and generalizing this learning.
And for some of our most complex learners that have, you know, what appear like very repetitive ways of engaging with resources, if it's something like that, like a rotational schema, play schema, for example, if you ever look up Athie's play schemas, that is so useful to understand as a piece of information, because there are a multitude of ways of extending a play schema, and actually sometimes it can be useful in supporting what can be relatively unproductive behaviors. So often throwing behaviors, when you start to analyze them, can be things like a trajectory schema that the child's interested in. But there are lots of other ways to kind of tap into and engage somebody who has a trajectory schema. Lots of activities that have trajectories and flows and things like that you can support you in replacing something like the fact that the child comes in the classroom and just throws everything straight away, which can be quite dangerous for the other pupils in the classroom and no doubt really unproductive. If we go back to thinking preparation for life, a lot of families will talk to us as a school about, like, would they come in and they just throw everything in the house? Like, how do I stop them doing that? Well, if it is something like a trajectory schema, it can be replaced with other types of more positive interaction with objects. So it's really, really, that kind of information can be so powerful on so many levels.
And again, I keep bringing this back to really basic stuff, but it is part of just getting to know that child as well as you possibly can. It's not surface level. This is deeper sort of understanding of what makes that child tick.
I think you make a really good point, because one of the things we do when we're engaged in school support, for example, we do meet a lot of people who will say, like, exactly like you've just said, like, it's all about how well you understand the child. and how well do you understand the child? And people will say, "Oh, I do understand. I do. We know. I know them better than anyone. Like the teaching assistant knows them better than anyone." And you get into those kinds of conversations. I think what's really interesting is it's how many provisions don't then build processes around that, though. And it's very interesting when you talk to somebody from a school that has processes around collating and kind of connecting that information, and schools that just have a kind of their vision or their ethos suggests that they do that. And the difference in the way those two provisions will describe a child is quite significant. It's really interesting because there's a way of saying, oh yeah, it's all about the child and we do understand the children and we get to know them really well, versus like a provision that actually has some processes that support that. And the level of depth they can often go to tell you about a child is very significant. And you can tell that they truly understand the child, like at quite a level of depth, like a granular level of depth. So that's really interesting. But sorry.
I was just going to sort of try and move on a little bit. I'm aware me and you could probably talk on these themes all day, literally. I was just going to sort of touch with, I feel like a lot of what we've talked about is sort of progressive and the way that we envision that schools should be thinking about learning and getting to know their children. And we've been sort of engaged in it ourselves for 10 to 15 years. And sort of this is a better way of doing things. Unfortunately, in my day-to-day work, and I'm sure you encounter it as well, a lot of specialist provision is still sort of stuck in a time maybe when me and you were teaching and we first emerged into the world of specialist education sort of I sort of getting on 15, 20 years ago for me, and sort of those ways that things were done where the starting point for everything was the data, and that was the data was the stuff that Ofsted would say, yeah, you're a brilliant school because look at your data. So understandably, it sort of trickled down that was right. Okay, if our data is really good, then we're going to get outstanding. And that's then the focus. So look at this tick list. You need to get 80% of that ticked off with this child this year. And that is still happening. And it's really worrying that is still, and in my experience, it's more likely to happen in secondary specialist provision still. I speak to people quite regularly, and my sort of role as an education advisor is a lot of it is around assessment and the conversation. Literally, I had a conversation with someone last week, assessment lead in a secondary school, and we cut it short after 5 minutes because it was quite clear that I'm not going to be able to make any progress here with you because this is, and it was perfectly pleasant, but it was like, oh no, we need that data because otherwise, how am I going to prove what's going on? And that was not a negotiable for that school. That is no. And I was like, okay, to be honest, it's probably not going to be a great use of either our time to carry on talking about this. If that is your absolute sort of concrete, non-negotiable, the data is the be all and end all. How can we encourage schools to do things in a slightly different way?
This is really interesting because there's a Ken Robinson quote, which I'll butcher here, but is about schools are organized as they are because they always have been, not because they must be. And I think we fall into that trap really, really easily. And if we go back in time, one of the things that we used to happen to us as a school is we'd have stakeholders come in. So whether that be a visit, any type of visitor, an inspector, a governor, whoever, and they'd come and visit the school and they would look around and we'd be showing them how we did everything and all of that. And they'd say, we'd show them our data and I'm like obsessed. If I'm going to do something, I'm one of those people that if I'm doing it right. So when we were producing data, it was ridiculous. It was sort of way more sort of data than you would ever need to prove anything, like reams and reams of data that look like rainbows and patterns, and I could pull all sorts of patterns out of it. Anyway, we'd be showing people that while we're showing them the curriculum. And then they'd be like, well, what, in your opinion, what's the best thing you do? What's the best outcome you have? And what's the impact of what you do? Inevitably, whether that was me, another leader, a teacher, a teaching assistant, one of the admin staff, anybody, they would talk about independence. Oh, the children are so independent. They develop these skills and they develop all of these independent skills. And their agency and their ability to it kind of self-initiate, and we talk about, and they go off and they talk really eloquently about all of this. And then they go, hang on, can I just look at your data again? So, but where's the independent stuff? And that's where we were. And that was a bit of a mind shift, probably I think it would be about 10 years ago. We had an inspection an Ofsted inspection where I described in minute detail what I'm about to describe to you about how our assessment works. But then I had this kind of data set to back it up. And the inspector just went, why do I need to see that? You've just explained this thing to me and shown me the evidence of it working. That looks really impressive, that rainbow over there, but I don't need to see it. It's totally irrelevant now you've explained that. And it was a proper, why have I even got this?
Yeah.
And I only wanted to show the inspector because I'd worked really hard. It was more of a please just look at it because I spent hours on this. And it was it was a moment of oh, he's on the same wavelength I am. Let's just never do this again. And
it's about that ability to communicate quality processes, and how are you identifying where you need to do things differently?
And so what we did at that point was, we need to acknowledge the kinds of progress that we want for our pupils. And actually, most kind of standard assessment frameworks don't do that. So, why are we doing maths, English, science, and ICT or something like that using pivots or one of the old derivatives of the P scales when we don't value hardly any of that actual progress? So what we tried to do at that point was develop an assessment framework that really sat as a process that enabled us to acknowledge any kind of bespoke progress that the child made at all. So the way that we assess our children is we pay heed to their EHC plans, and we work really hard to get the outcomes and ambitions in those accurate for our children, because we have to do that because of what I'm about to describe. So we put a lot of work into making sure that's accurate. Then what we do is we will work backwards from those back down to the classroom and look at what are we trying to get to here at the end of a key stage or adulthood even, or what is the ultimate goal for this child? Then we're thinking about in a classroom, where is the child right now, that understanding of characteristics? What is the next tiny step towards that ultimate goal? How are we going to get there? And what we do as a school is across those domains I was talking about earlier, so right across the holistic development of the child, we use the code of practice, the current code of practice areas. We will set a developmental outcome that is 6 to 12 weeks from where they are now. And that'll be absolutely tiny. Now, in order to set that step, the staff in the school are allowed to use any document, framework, anything they want to support them to make that decision. So what we have as a school on our server is every framework, developmental framework, assessment framework that has ever commercially or just in public domain existed for the last about 20 years. So we have all of those different patterns. Some of them are commercial ones that we've purchased. Some are ones that had been in the public domain, things like Roots for Learning developed by the Welsh government. And we have all of those available to our staff. So the staff understand where the child is, and then what they will do is set a robust outcome that's only 6 to 12 weeks away. When that's achieved, that'll be turned over, and we'll just keep that moving and keep that moving. But they're allowed to make those decisions based on any source they want that gives them a developmental pattern. So you might have one child in the school. What we actually use for assessment is what progress are they making towards the outcomes in their personalized learning plans. So all of the information, all of the evidence we gather through our evidence collection tools, all just contributes to what progress are they making towards those steps in their personalized learning plans, and are they achieving those? What the staff will then talk about with senior leaders is why they made the decisions that was the next step. And what they might sometimes use to back that up is say, well, I looked at this assessment framework that actually talks about social development, and it suggested that that's a pattern of development that somebody would go through, and actually that seems to be where they're headed, so I use that to set these next steps. They will also use their own professional judgment to set steps that might sit in between steps or certain patterns. The other thing that we will also look at for our children is their lateral progress. So we will look at are they maintaining that skill or that knowledge? Are they, how fluent, what does their fluency look like? How generalized is their use of that? How independently can they do that? And we will be looking at that at the same time. So sometimes what we're looking at is development that looks lateral rather than linear, but those linear patterns can go anywhere and be from anywhere. So it
sounds like flexibility is so important there, and that's always I try and get across flexibility of assessment to adjust and adapt to the individual child in question, really.
But you require it's the ecosystem that sits around that has to be strong and robust. So the way you collect that and the way you challenge that and the way you monitor that has to be really strong and robust. But yeah, and it's not, I mean, if you were a brand new teacher at my school, we don't just go, just use anything you want, and then watch you panic. It's, we have suggested frameworks for pathways where we're like, this loosely, like this kind of matches. And once somebody's kind of at grips with using that, we'll say, right, stabilizers are off.
But as long as those individual frameworks are not put too high on a pedestal of this is the answer, and for me, that's never been the case. It's about, pick and choose and use your professional judgment and all the rest of it. Just finally, because we're going on a little bit just around sort of the notion, and I think everything you've described really comes back to this. It's sort of around the importance of brave leadership, especially in the specialist environment. Why is it so important to be a brave leader?
I just think there's a few things. It goes right back to that Ken Robinson quote, doesn't it? It's the idea that, like, why are you doing what you're doing? Do you have to do what you've always done, or do you need to do something else to actually meet the needs of your children? And it's about what's doing right for them. Who are they? Where are they headed, and how are you going to get them there? And I think part of it, we're seeing right across the education sector a massive complexity shift. So special schools are more complex than they've ever been. Mainstream schools the same. And this is what we're seeing. And I think one of the things we're experiencing as well is there is a research and practice gap. So for some of our most complex learners, there isn't very much research, and there's a lot of rather than it be evidence-based practice, you have to draw on a lot of practice-based evidence. So you're having to take reflective approaches to the children that you work with, which are linked to assessment, because that's how you're going to demonstrate impact. So you're going to have a look at how you're working with this child. Is that working? Does that need changing? Do I need to look at a different strategy or a different aspect of the strategy? And what impact do I have a way of actually measuring that impact? Which is when we get to the assessment framework thing, to go back to that, you have to be measuring the thing you're trying to grow. Like, otherwise, how do you know it's working? And I think that's where the bravery comes in, is that some of this is, we know that there are certain strategies that work. Some of our more complex learners don't easily access those strategies. So there has to be a reflective approach to how do we adopt and adapt that strategy to get that to work for that learner, to get them to where they need to be. Do we have an understanding of how that works and fits together? And are we prepared to go? It's a bit like skiing, isn't it? It's like you kind of got like 1 foot slightly off piste. Like, are you prepared to have one of your skis going through the like deep snow while the other one stays on the run? And there has to be that element of having the guts to do that, I think, to do what's right. It has to be what's right for the children and young people, the most vulnerable and complex children and young people in all of education that attend some of our specialist settings and our ARPs and hubs. Are we prepared to do what's right to meet their needs?
I think that that bravery has to come from a confidence that you are doing the right thing, doesn't it? And if you are confident in describing the decision-making process, then you'll probably be fine. And you're basing it on knowledge and understanding. And I think so often people sort of panic and they want something that will demonstrate, and they can just hand a piece of paper and say, look, we're great. But actually, you've got to be able to verbalize, communicate why you've done something, how you've done something, and why it's great.
And that is leadership again, isn't it? I think we need leaders. I mean, you and I have been on a particular journey through our careers, like 20 years of working through specialist provisions and kind of sitting in this world. But I think it's really important that we have leaders that have that knowledge and that understanding, because otherwise they can't go to that level of depth of thought. So that's one point made. But then I think also as a leader, it's really important that you create systems and processes that sort of protect, encourage, and facilitate that kind of bravery in your own staff as well. Like, they've got to know that you support them and that you're gonna protect them, that they're working within this safe environment. And that goes back to, quite boringly, like, processes. Like, do your processes facilitate that type of practice? And do your staff understand that that's supporting them to be bold as well in their decisions? And I think that's where that leadership bravery sits as well.
Well, that's where you're going to get staff that flourish as well, if you're giving them the autonomy and ownership of how you get from point A to point B. And obviously it needs to sit within our ethos as a school and our pedagogy, but you're going to be given trust that your judgment and your knowledge and your awareness of that child is sound. So thank you so much for joining us today, James. It's been a really fascinating chat. And like I said, I think we could have doubled the amount of time we were talking about any of this, but really appreciate it. And thank you for joining us.
No problem. Lovely to spend the time with you.